The cliffs of Capri rise like jagged fangs from the blue waters of the Tyrrhenian Sea. To the casual eye, it is a paradise. Sunlight dancing on turquoise waves, the scent of salt and citrus heavy in the air. But nearly 2,000 years ago, this island became something very different. To the Romans, it was whispered of as a prison without walls, a place where the emperor himself ruled with appetites that were as unrestrained as they were terrifying. Here, on this isolated outpost, the ruler of the known world built not just villas of marble and luxury, but chambers of shame, pools of innocence defiled, and grottos turned into theaters of cruelty. His name was Tiberius, the second emperor of Rome. His retreat to Capri has become one of the most scandalous legends in all of ancient history. The whispers began almost immediately. Rome's citizens gossiped in smoky taverns, senators muttered behind closed doors, and slaves who had seen too much carried fragments of stories. Children forced to serve not as attendants, but as objects of lust. Noble women humiliated before their rivals. Grotesque rituals in which sex was no longer a matter of passion, but of domination and spectacle. For centuries, chroniclers have debated how much of this was true, how much was slander, and how much was propaganda. Yet even through layers of exaggeration, the picture that emerges is one of excess so vile, so calculated, that it horrified even the Romans, people who themselves were no strangers to indulgence. To understand why Capri became a symbol of depravity, we must first understand Tiberius himself. Born into the shadow of Augustus, Rome's first emperor, Tiberius was never meant to be remembered as a monster. He was a skilled general, a man who expanded the empire's borders and crushed its enemies. But behind the victories lay bitterness. He was forced into marriages he did not want, controlled by a family dynasty that used him as a pawn, and overshadowed by the golden image of Augustus's chosen heirs. By the time power finally fell into his hands, Tiberius was old, disillusioned, and deeply mistrustful. Rome to him was not the heart of civilization, but a viper's nest of treachery. And so, in the year 26 CE, he did the unthinkable. He abandoned the capital and withdrew to Capri. The Senate was stunned. The emperor would rule not from Rome, but from a secluded island across the sea. At first, this was seen as eccentric, perhaps even practical. Capri's cliffs were easily defended, its isolation a shield against conspiracies. But the retreat quickly gained a darker reputation. What began as seclusion turned into exile from morality. The emperor surrounded himself with astrologers, flatterers, guards, and a rotating stream of young men and women. Villas like the Villa Jovis, perched high above the sea, became fortresses of secrecy, and secrecy, in Rome, always bred rumor. The stories that leaked out were not of imperial decrees or military orders, but of swimming pools filled with children trained to pleasure their emperor, of rooms decorated not with statues of gods, but with obscene tableaux of living bodies forced into grotesque poses, of the emperor himself watching, detached, as if orchestrating a ritual rather than committing an act of desire. Capri became known not as a retreat, but as a stage where innocence was sacrificed to the whims of an emperor consumed by power and fear. This is the world we are about to enter, a world where sex was no longer private, but weaponized, where power was measured not in armies or gold, but in how deeply one could degrade another human being, and where the ruler of the Roman Empire turned paradise into a place of whispered nightmares. The island of Capri, Tiberius' island of terror, was a place where the boundaries of taboo shattered, and the true horror was only just beginning. 2. The Romans, power was not just something wielded on the battlefield or in the Senate chambers. It seeped into every aspect of life, into religion, into dining, into family, and into the bedchamber. Nowhere was this more evident than in the reign of Tiberius on Capri, where sexuality became both his refuge and his weapon. For him, desire was never about intimacy, it was about control. Those who entered his island domain quickly learned that nothing was private. Young men, often from noble families, were summoned as attendants, but stripped of dignity, compelled to serve the emperor in ways that blurred the line between servant and victim. Women, wives, daughters, concubines, were coerced into humiliating acts under the gaze of their ruler. To resist was unthinkable. To refuse was dangerous. In the silent economy of the imperial court, submission was survival. Roman society was already drenched in hypocrisy. Officially, Augustus had established strict laws about morality, punishing adultery, encouraging traditional marriage, enforcing virtue as a civic duty. But beneath the veneer, the elite lived double lives. Slaves were used as playthings, mistresses were flaunted, and temples themselves often hosted rituals where pleasure mingled with prayer. Tiberius did not invent the marriage of sex and power. He perfected it, sharpening it into a tool of domination, so refined that it turned bodies into instruments of fear. The whispers spoke of games designed not for pleasure, but for degradation. Children, nicknamed minnows, were allegedly trained to swim between the emperor's legs, their innocence twisted into spectacle. Courtiers were forced into obscene performances. Their shame meant not just for the emperor's amusement, but as a reminder that no one on Capri held power but him. It was not enough for Tiberius to be emperor of Rome. He needed to be emperor of flesh, of desire, of the most private corners of the human spirit. The psychology of control through intimacy is as old as kingship itself. By possessing another's body, a ruler proved total dominance. In Rome, to humiliate a senator's wife was to weaken the senator. To claim a general's son was to remind the general that his loyalty could be broken. Every act of sexual degradation carried political weight. Capri's rituals were not random debaucheries, but carefully staged displays of sovereignty. And yet, beyond the politics, there was something darker, a personal hunger. Tiberius had lived much of his life in restraint, forced into loveless marriages, overshadowed by others. On Capri, free from scrutiny, his desires erupted in forms that shocked even Rome. To him, these were not crimes, but entitlements. If he was the embodiment of Rome itself, then all of Rome's bodies belonged. To him, in his mind, intimacy was not an exchange, it was a command. This twisted relationship between power and desire was reflected across Roman culture. Gladiators were paraded as both warriors and objects of lust. Slaves were bought not just for labor, but for pleasure. Even in mythology, the gods themselves ruled through seduction, rape, and transformation. Jupiter disguised himself to possess mortal women. Mars and Venus conducted affairs that embarrassed Olympus itself. Romans saw these tales not as moral warnings, but as reflections of their own world. In such a society, was it any wonder that Tiberius felt justified in turning Capri into a theatre of indulgence? Yet there was a difference. While others hid their excesses behind closed doors, Tiberius institutionalized his. He did not merely indulge in taboo, he weaponized it, bending the people around him into tools of humiliation. The island became a laboratory of submission, where power was not measured in laws or legions, but in how far he could push the boundaries of human degradation. And so Capri's reputation grew. Every ship that left its shores carried more than goods. It carried stories, tales of innocence shattered, of nobility disgraced, of the emperor himself sinking deeper into rituals that blurred the line between man and monster. Rome listened, with horror, fascination, and disgust. For if Tiberius could wield sex as power, what did that say about the empire itself? The answer, whispered across taverns and marble halls alike, was chilling. The empire was only as moral as the man who ruled it. And on Capri, morality had drowned in the depths of desire. The stories that seeped from Capri into Rome were not whispers of luxury. They were cries of horror wrapped in scandal. Suetonius, writing decades later, painted the island as a stage of grotesque rituals. Whether exaggerated or not, These accounts have haunted Tiberius's legacy for centuries. One tale described children, barely past infancy, trained to swim between the emperor's thighs during his baths. Nicknamed minnows, they were forced into acts that reduced innocence to spectacle. For the Romans, who tolerated much in the realm of lust, this crossed even their flexible boundaries. To corrupt children was beyond indulgence. It was an assault on nature itself. Other stories told of orgiastic performances staged in lavish halls overlooking the sea. Senators' wives and daughters, compelled to participate, were stripped of dignity in public spectacles where the emperor sat not as lover but as judge. Bodies became props in obscene tableaux, acts of submission framed as rituals of devotion. Those who tried to refuse found themselves disgraced, exiled, or worse. Tacitus, ever the stern moralist, was less explicit than Suetonius, but equally damning. He wrote of debaucheries so foul that words themselves are shamed. In the silence of his phrasing, the horror grew even larger. The absence of detail was not protection, it was condemnation, suggesting acts so disturbing that even Rome's chroniclers could not set them fully to page. Yet Capri was not only a stage for pleasure, it was a prison of power. The island's high cliffs ensured escape was impossible. Guests brought for feasts often discovered that they were not invited, but trapped. To disobey Tiberius in these moments was unthinkable. To survive meant compliance, and compliance meant carrying a secret so shameful it could never be spoken aloud. The aftermath of these tales was devastating. Rome's senators whispered of an emperor no longer human, but consumed by madness. Citizens turned Capri into a metaphor for corruption, mocking Tiberius in graffiti and satirical plays. And yet, beneath the disgust, there was fascination. Rome could not look away. The island became a dark mirror, reflecting the empire's own hypocrisies. Moral on the surface, depraved at the core. Capri was no longer paradise. It was the emperor's island of terror, where innocence drowned, power humiliated, and desire mutated into something monstrous. And with each passing year, the stories grew darker still. On Capri, sex was never only about desire, it was politics sharpened into a blade. Every act of submission, every forced ritual, was a test of loyalty and a trap of compromise. Tiberius understood that Rome's nobility feared humiliation more than death, and he used that fear to control them. Noble families sent their sons and daughters to Capri, hoping to win favor. Instead, many found themselves entangled in shame. A senator's daughter compelled to perform before rivals was not just disgraced, her father's political power was broken. A general whose son was forced into the emperor's games could never, again, stand proudly in the Senate without whispers echoing behind him. Capri became a theater of blackmail, where the cost of entry was one's dignity, and the price of refusal could be exile, confiscation of estates, or a quiet execution. The emperor's prefect, Sejanus, mastered this game as well. While Tiberius withdrew deeper into his island pleasures, Sejanus used the gossip of Capri to entrap enemies in Rome. A man accused of resisting the emperor's demands could be painted as disloyal. A rival whose family had been humiliated could be manipulated into silence. Sexual scandal became a political currency, traded like gold, leaving reputations ruined and alliances shattered. Religion, too, was twisted into the spectacle. Shrines to Venus and Priapus decorated Capri's villas, but they were no longer sites of worship. They were stages. Rituals that once symbolized fertility and divine blessing were warped into excuses for orchestrated orgies. To participate was to appear loyal to the emperor's divine will. To hesitate was to risk being marked as an enemy of Rome's most powerful man. This was the genius and the terror of Tiberius's island. It blurred every line. Was the senator's wife a victim or a collaborator? Was the general's son enslaved or willingly corrupted for advancement? In Rome's eyes, guilt and shame were inseparable, and so no one emerged from Capri unstained. By turning sex into politics, Tiberius ensured that Capri's horrors reached far beyond its cliffs. Each scandal tightened his grip, for the victim's silence became his shield. They could not expose him without exposing themselves. In this way, Capri was more than an island of indulgence. It was a fortress of fear, where lust was law, and politics was written on the flesh of Rome's elite. While Capri's marble halls echoed with whispers of scandal, the shadows of those stories reached far into the streets of Rome. To the common people, Tiberius's island became a symbol of everything rotten at the heart of the empire. Rumors trickled down through taverns and marketplaces, carried by servants and sailors. Each retelling grew darker, each detail more obscene. Capri was no longer just a retreat. It was a warning whispered in disgust. For the elite, however, hypocrisy was a way of life. Senators condemned Tiberius in private, but mimicked his indulgences in secret. Men who sneered at the emperor's depravity still bought slave boys and girls for their households. Women mocked the humiliation of Capri's victims, yet fought to keep their own daughters close, terrified they too might be summoned across the sea. It was a society where morality was preached as law, but corruption was lived as daily routine. Marriage itself revealed the double standard. A Roman husband was permitted to stray with slaves, mistresses, or prostitutes without scandal, while a wife risked ruin or death for even a hint of infidelity. Capri exaggerated these rules to grotesque extremes. The emperor claimed not only wives, but children, blurring every line of what Roman society pretended to protect. The island laid bare the truth. In Rome, intimacy was not about love, but hierarchy. Slaves suffered most of all. Already treated as property, they became expendable tools in Capri's rituals. To a slave, there was no choice, no refusal. Their bodies were offerings to imperial appetite, and their silence was enforced by the lash. Yet even freeborn citizens, once summoned, discovered that freedom ended at Capri's shore. The emperor's desire did not discriminate between classes. It consumed all. What unsettled Rome most was not just the acts themselves, but the cultural reflection. Capri exposed what the empire already was, a society built on domination, where the strong took what they wished from the weak. Tiberius had not invented Rome's hypocrisy. He had stripped it bare, displaying it in spectacles too obscene to deny. For the common people, this hypocrisy curdled into fear. If the emperor could violate every law of nature and custom, then what law could protect the ordinary Roman? Capri was not simply the emperor's island of shame, it was a mirror of an empire collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. By the late 20s CE, Capri was no longer just a retreat. It was a fortress of secrets, and within its walls, Tiberius himself began to unravel. What had started as indulgence transformed into paranoia, cruelty, and isolation. The emperor, who once commanded Rome's legions, now commanded only shadows and whispers, retreating deeper into rituals that horrified his subjects and alienated his allies. The most dangerous shift came with his growing distrust of the Senate and the nobility. From his villa on the cliffs, Tiberius issued orders for trials in Rome, accusing senators and rivals of treason. Secrecy fed suspicion, and suspicion bred terror. Many of these accusations were fueled by the island's scandals. Men who had resisted his demands could be labeled traitors. Families who had suffered humiliation remained silent, for to speak was to destroy themselves. Capri became both crime scene and courtroom, where one's shame determined one's survival. The turning point came with the rise and fall of Sejanus, the powerful praetorian prefect who had long managed the empire in Tiberius's absence. Sejanus understood the value of Capri's secrets. He manipulated them, turning rumors of the emperor's depravity into weapons against his rivals. Those who mocked Tiberius's excesses in private found themselves exposed, exiled, or executed. For a time, it seemed Sejanus held the empire in his hands, but power breeds arrogance. When whispers grew that Sejanus aspired to rule in Tiberius' place, the emperor struck back. Orders were dispatched from Capri. Sejanus was to be arrested in the Senate itself. His supporters were hunted down, his children executed. In the aftermath, the purges only deepened Tiberius's isolation. He trusted no one, not even his own kin. Capri became a throne built on fear, and with fear came escalation. Accounts from this period describe the emperor retreating further into grotesque indulgence, as though each new scandal was a defiant response to Rome's disgust. Children continued to be summoned. Noble families lived in dread of the imperial summons, knowing that refusal meant ruin, but compliance meant shame. The rituals grew darker, less about pleasure than about proving he could do what no one else dared. To Tiberius, degradation had become sovereignty itself. For the people of Rome, Capri was no longer a distant island. It was a symbol of a government that had abandoned its people. Satirical graffiti mocked the emperor as Caprine, a goat among humans. Rumors turned him into a beast, a man whose lusts had stripped away his humanity. Even his victories as a general, once remembered with respect, were overshadowed by tales of blood and lust spilled on Capri's shores. The empire itself was at a breaking point, a ruler consumed by paranoia, an island stained with scandal, and a population that no longer trusted the moral fabric of its leaders. Capri was no longer paradise. It had become a prison for an emperor and a warning for a civilization. The man who had fled Rome to escape its corruption had, in his seclusion, become its very embodiment. The stage was set. Tiberius's power still held, but the tide of disgust was rising. What began as whispers would soon harden into history, cementing his name among the most infamous rulers of Rome. Capri had changed from sanctuary to sentence, and Tiberius's reign would never recover. When Tiberius died in 37 CE, the Senate and people of Rome did not mourn him as they had Augustus. They sighed in relief. Capri had poisoned his legacy so thoroughly that even his accomplishments as a general, administrator, and stabilizer of the empire were eclipsed by the tales of his island of terror. His name was no longer remembered as the steady hand of Rome's second emperor, but as a symbol of corruption and perversion. The consequences of his retreat to Capri rippled far beyond his death. In Rome, whispers hardened into myth. Graffiti scrawled on walls caricatured him as a goat, a beast consumed by lust. Satirical plays mocked him as a man who ruled not with decrees, but with debauchery. For centuries, the phrase Caprine habits became shorthand for depravity, cementing Capri in the Roman imagination as a place of shame rather than beauty. Politically, Tiberius's scandals deepened the empire's crisis of trust. The Senate, already weakened under Augustus, found itself further diminished. How could senators claim moral authority when they themselves had been participants or victims of Capri's humiliations? The ruling class was tainted by association. Those who had complied carried the shame in silence, and those who had resisted were long dead. The island had destroyed not only reputations, but the very possibility of dignity in Rome's politics. Culturally, the impact was just as profound. Rome had always walked a thin line between indulgence and morality, but Tiberius's legacy tipped the balance. His excesses became a cautionary tale for later emperors. Suetonius, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio used Capri as the ultimate example of how unchecked lust corrodes rule. To them, it was proof that private vice becomes public ruin, and that an empire's moral fabric is tied to the appetites of its leader. Religion, too, responded. As Christianity slowly spread through the empire in later centuries, Tiberius's legacy became a convenient tool. Christian writers pointed to Capri as evidence of pagan depravity, contrasting the emperor's alleged sins with the purity of Christian morality. For them, Tiberius embodied the corruption of Rome itself, a civilization collapsing under its lusts. Even archaeology whispers his shame. On Capri, Ruins of the Villa Jovis and other palaces still stand, their marble floors and cliffside chambers silent witnesses to what may have happened there. Frescoes and fragments hint at luxury, but cannot confirm the darkest stories. Yet, the absence of proof has never erased the memory. Instead, the ruins invite imagination, encouraging each visitor to picture the island as it was described, an emperor's gilded prison of lust and terror. In the end, the greatest consequence of Capri was the transformation of Tiberius into legend. He might have hoped to escape Rome's corruption by withdrawing to an island paradise. Instead, he became its most infamous monster. The scandals of Capri ensured that history would remember him not for his victories or reforms, but for the whispers of children in baths, nobles humiliated in grotesque rituals, and an emperor who turned desire into tyranny. Tiberius's reign stands as a reminder that the abuse of power does not die with the ruler. It lingers in memory, shaping how societies judge their leaders, how cultures tell their stories, and how empires measure their own decay. Capri was not only his island of terror, it was Rome's mirror, reflecting the darkness it carried within. The story of Tiberius and his island of Capri lingers not simply because of what may have happened there, but because of what it reveals about the nature of power itself. History is filled with rulers who wore crowns of gold while hiding appetites of darkness, but rarely has the veil been so thoroughly torn away. Capri stands as one of history's most haunting reminders that absolute power has the capacity not just to corrupt, but to consume. When we think of Rome, we often picture marble temples, grand legions, and emperors draped in purple. Yet beneath that glory ran rivers of silence, of victims forced into compliance, of lives bent under the weight of another's desire. Tiberius's island of terror exposed the fragile boundary between civilization and savagery. What was celebrated as paradise became infamous as a prison. What was meant to be a retreat from Rome's corruption instead revealed its soul. Modern readers are left with unsettling questions. How much of the Capri scandals were true, and how much were inventions of hostile senators or later historians? Eager to vilify? We may never know. But in a sense, the question of truth matters less than the legacy of perception, because whether these acts happened exactly as Suetonius described or not, the world believed them. And in the realm of power, belief can be more devastating than fact. That is why Tiberius remains a figure of fascination. He is not remembered as a competent general or administrator, roles he certainly fulfilled, but as the emperor who turned his paradise into a nightmare. His story echoes through every age because it touches on something timeless. The way those in power use intimacy, secrecy, and fear as weapons. The details may change, the settings may shift, but the pattern remains disturbingly familiar. In the modern world, we still see leaders, celebrities, and the wealthy exposed in scandals of hidden appetites. Behind locked doors, in guarded estates, or on private islands, stories emerge of abuse, exploitation, and the manipulation of the vulnerable. The stage may no longer be Capri, but the script remains the same. Desire twisted into domination, reputation built on silence, and downfall, ensured by excess. The island of Capri still stands, its cliffs rising above the sea as if daring history to forget. Tourists walk through the ruins of Villa Jovis, gazing at weathered walls and wondering if the stones once witnessed horrors too vile to name. The sea below sparkles as it did in Tiberius's day, but the water carries whispers of what may have. Drowned there, innocence, morality, humanity itself. And so, the tale of Tiberius is not merely ancient scandal, it is a warning, a reminder that when desire is unchecked, when power is absolute, when secrecy is guarded more fiercely than justice, corruption is inevitable. Capri was not just an island of terror, it was a mirror. It showed Rome what it truly was, and in that reflection, we can still glimpse ourselves. The real question is this: when history looks back on our own age, whose islands will it remember? Whose secrets will it whisper? And what horrors, buried beneath luxury and silence, still wait to be uncovered?